I remember the exact moment I signed the prenuptial agreement. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. The room was quiet, too quiet. Just the soft hum of the air conditioner, the scratch of the lawyer's pen, and Laura sitting across from me with her hands folded, calm, composed, almost relieved. She didn't look at me when she slid the papers forward. She didn't need to. In her mind, this wasn't about trust. It was about logic, about control, about protecting herself from a future she feared more than she feared hurting me. And I signed. No questions, no arguments, no pause dramatic enough to raise suspicion. People think that moment defines weakness, submission, but what they don't understand is this. Sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one with nothing to gain or nothing visible to lose. Laura explained it carefully, like someone delivering bad news wrapped in good intentions. She talked about her childhood, about watching money tear her parents apart, about how instability rots love from the inside. She said she loved me. She said this was just a safeguard, a technicality, a way to make sure nothing ugly ever came between us. I nodded. I smiled. I told her I understood. And I did. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the agreement didn't protect her from me. It protected her from the truth. At that time, I was exactly who she believed I was, or at least that's how it looked on paper. Mid-level analyst, stable income, no real assets, no inheritance, no ambition that reached beyond a quiet life. I drove an ordinary car, wore ordinary clothes, took ordinary vacations. I had learned long before I met Laura that being forgettable was safer than being impressive. My father taught me that lesson with his death. Michael Carter was not an ordinary man. The world never connected us because I made sure it didn't. To the public, he was a ghost, an architect behind structures no one could trace. Private equity, energy, international holdings layered so deep they disappeared into one another. Tens of billions moving quietly, legally, invisibly. And then, one day, he was gone. The official story was simple. Sudden illness, complications, end of discussion. But money like that doesn't exist without enemies, and power doesn't disappear without consequences. When the trust was created, the conditions were brutal and absolute. No public association, no lifestyle changes, no access until a fixed age. One violation meant everything froze, permanently. The lawyers didn't call it protection. They called it survival. So I stayed small. I stayed quiet. I married Laura as Ethan Carter, the man she thought she understood. And for a while, that was enough. I loved her, truly. I admired her drive, her clarity, her hunger to move forward. I supported her promotions, her late nights, her growing circle of ambitious friends who spoke about startups and exits and futures that always sounded loud and urgent. And I stayed the same. That's when the distance began. It wasn't sudden. It never is. It crept in through small comments, casual comparisons, questions disguised as concern. Are you happy where you are? Do you ever think about doing more? Don't you want something bigger? At first, I thought patience would answer those questions. I believed consistency had value, that stability mattered. But respect doesn't erode loudly. It fades, quietly, like interest lost over time. Her friends would smile politely at me. Her family would ask careful questions about my plans. I could feel it, the unspoken calculation, the silent judgment. I was safe, dependable, and increasingly insufficient. I watched Laura pull ahead while I stayed exactly where I was meant to be. And here's the cruel part. She wasn't wrong to feel frustrated. She just didn't know the clock was already ticking. Every year, every month, every day brought me closer to the moment when the trust would mature, when the anonymity would end, when the walls I lived behind would legally disappear. But how do you tell the person you love that the life they're disappointed in is temporary by design? How do you explain that your silence is not stagnation, but restraint? I couldn't, and I didn't. So when Laura finally sat across from me again, this time with a different lawyer, different papers, and a calm certainty in her eyes. I wasn't surprised. She said the marriage had run its course, that we wanted different futures, that the prenup made everything simple, clean, efficient. And once again, I signed. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Told the truth too early and risk everything, or stayed silent and let the consequences unfold? Because here's what Laura didn't realize as she walked away believing she had closed a chapter. The agreement she trusted so much had just locked her out of a story that was about to be written in headlines. And I was done hiding. Not out of revenge, not yet, but because some secrets don't stay buried forever. They wait for the moment they'll hurt the most. The days after the divorce were strangely quiet. No shouting, no tears, no dramatic scenes. Just paperwork and space. Laura moved out efficiently, like someone closing a completed project. She took what the prenup allowed: furniture, personal items, a shared sense of closure. She told friends it was mutual, amicable, necessary, and maybe she even believed that. I stayed in the apartment alone, surrounded by silence that felt heavier than grief. People assume divorce hurts because of loss. For me, it hurt because of timing. Every morning I checked the date without meaning to. The number stared back at me like a countdown I couldn't stop. Weeks left, days shrinking. The trust was approaching maturity, and with it, the end of a life I had carefully maintained for decades. I didn't celebrate. I didn't plan. I waited. Because when something has been hidden long enough, the reveal doesn't need force. It needs precision. The first call came from my attorney. His voice was professional, but there was a shift in it, respect layered with something closer to caution. The final signatures were complete, the legal barriers dissolved, the identity firewall collapsed in one irreversible moment. The trust was mine. $50 billion. Not pending, not theoretical, real. Accounts unlocked, holdings transferred, control restored. I didn't feel powerful. I felt exposed. For years, staying invisible had been my armor. Now the armor was gone, and the world did what it always does when it senses movement at the top. It leaned in. The first leak wasn't intentional. It never is. A regulatory filing, a mandatory disclosure, a name that shouldn't have mattered suddenly mattered a lot. Ethan Carter. Financial journalists did what they're trained to do. They followed threads, they connected entities, they pulled history forward. Within 48 hours, the story was everywhere. The silent hero, a fortune hidden in plain sight. One man now controls one of the largest private trusts in the country. Markets reacted before emotions could. Boards restructured, executives asked careful questions. People who had never returned my emails suddenly remembered my number. And Laura? She found out the same way everyone else did. I imagined her phone vibrating on the kitchen counter, a message from a friend, a headline link, a pause, another link, then silence. I wasn't there to see her reaction, but I didn't need to be. I knew her well enough to picture it. The disbelief first, then the denial, then the slow, sick realization that the life she thought she understood never existed. The irony was sharp. She had wanted protection from instability. She had feared the unknown. And in doing so, she had walked directly away from the most stable future either of us would ever know. But this wasn't revenge. Not yet. Revenge implies intent, planning, malice. This was consequence. I didn't call her. I didn't explain. I didn't correct the narrative. Silence had served me well for most of my life. I let it speak again. Friends reached out cautiously, old colleagues suddenly curious, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years expressed concern, pride, confusion, all at once. Everyone wanted context. Everyone wanted proximity. Laura's family was quieter. Too quiet. I wondered what she was telling herself. Was she replaying every conversation, every argument about ambition, every moment she had mistaken restraint for lack of drive? When you discover you were wrong about someone at that scale, it doesn't just change your opinion of them, it rewrites your judgment of yourself. Days passed, interviews were requested, invitations extended. I declined most of them. I wasn't interested in announcing myself. The announcement had already happened. What interested me was watching how quickly perception changes. The same qualities that once made me unmotivated were now labeled disciplined. The same silence once called passivity was reframed as strategic. The same stability once dismissed as small was described as controlled. Nothing about me had changed, only the number attached to my name. And that's when the anger arrived. Not loud, not explosive, controlled. I wasn't angry at Laura for leaving. People leave for reasons that make sense to them. I was angry at the assumption beneath it, that value must always announce itself early, loudly, visibly, that love can be measured by trajectory instead of character. Late one night, I found myself scrolling through old photos, vacations we took, dinners we shared, moments that felt real because they were real. And I wondered, if she had known then, would she have stayed? Or worse, would she have stayed for the wrong reasons? That question haunted me more than the divorce itself, because what was taken from me wasn't money or reputation. It was certainty. Certainty that I had been loved for who I was, not what I would become. The prenup had done exactly what it was designed to do. It protected assets, it created clean lines, it removed ambiguity, but it also removed the one thing no document can guarantee: understanding. And now, with the world watching and Laura silent, I felt something shift inside me. Not a desire to punish, but a need to let truth finish what silence had started. Because when someone walks away believing they made the rational choice, sometimes the most powerful response is letting them live with the full cost of that logic. And the cost was just beginning to surface. The silence didn't last. It never does when money enters the conversation. Laura called me 3 days after the headlines peaked. Not immediately, not impulsively. She waited just long enough to convince herself the call was reasonable, casual, mature, as if we were two people reconnecting after a misunderstanding, not two lives violently recontextualized overnight. I let it ring, not out of cruelty, out of instinct. When you've spent a lifetime surviving by restraint, you learn that timing matters more than words. I watched the phone vibrate itself still. Then, minutes later, a message appeared. "Can we talk?" No punctuation, no warmth, just urgency disguised as composure. I didn't reply. Instead, I went for a walk. Same route I'd taken 100 times before. Same streets, same faces, but everything felt altered, like the city had learned my name before I was ready to hear it spoken aloud. People think power announces itself with noise. In reality, it moves quietly first, through back channels, through meetings that don't make calendars, through decisions that shift weight without explanation. By the time Laura called again that evening, 3 board seats had changed hands. 2 legacy executives had stepped aside. A long-stalled energy acquisition resumed negotiations that had been frozen for years, all without me saying a word publicly. That was the part no one understood, not even her. I finally answered on the 3rd call. "Ethan," she said. My name sounded unfamiliar in her mouth, like she was testing it against a new definition. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I believed her. That wasn't the problem. "I know," I said. There was a pause, the kind that stretches while someone recalibrates their strategy mid-sentence. "If I had," she began, then stopped herself. "I mean, everything makes sense now." There it was. Not apology, not regret. Context. As if understanding the money retroactively corrected the judgment. We talked for 20 minutes, about neutral things, about logistics she no longer needed to manage, about how overwhelming the media attention must be. She spoke carefully, like someone stepping across glass, trying not to sound eager. She never asked to meet, not directly, but she didn't have to. I could hear it in the way she lingered, in the softening of her tone, in the subtle shift from certainty to possibility. When we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time replaying the conversation in my head. Not her words, but the version of me she was now speaking to. This Ethan was different. He was suddenly interesting, suddenly layered, suddenly worth curiosity. And that hurt more than I expected. The next few days unfolded with a precision that felt almost mechanical. Analysts speculated, commentators debated, former associates of my father surfaced, each claiming proximity, insight, relevance. I said nothing. Behind the scenes, however, I began moving pieces. Quiet philanthropy, strategic investments, restructuring trusts that had been designed to outlive me, now recalibrated to reflect my own ethics. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was reclaiming authorship. Laura watched all of it. I know she did because she referenced it in her next message, complimented my thoughtful approach, said she'd always known I was different. That last part almost made me laugh. Always. Memory is flexible when pride is at stake. One evening, she suggested coffee, framed it as closure, as adults revisiting something unfinished. I agreed, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted clarity. We met at a quiet place near the river, neutral ground, no history. She arrived early, stood when she saw me, smiled too quickly. She looked the same, polished, confident, but there was something else underneath now. Uncertainty, maybe, or calculation. "I wish I had known," she said after we sat. "I wish you had asked," I replied. That landed harder than I intended. She defended herself gently, talked about assumptions, about how people present themselves, about how she had only seen what I allowed her to see. And she was right, but she missed the point. I didn't hide to deceive you. I hide to survive. Her eyes flickered. For a moment, the conversation stopped being theoretical. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about timing. She left when the future looked small. She returned when it looked inevitable. And if I let her back into my life now, if I accepted her revised understanding, I would never know whether she loved the man who waited or the outcome he had protected. As we parted, she touched my arm, lightly, familiar, testing the boundary. "Whatever happens," she said, "I hope you know I never meant to hurt you." I nodded. Intent doesn't erase impact. That night, alone again, I asked myself a question that had been circling for weeks. Was walking away punishment enough? Or did real revenge require something quieter, more enduring? Because sometimes revenge isn't about taking something away. It's about refusing to give something back. And as Laura drove home believing possibilities still existed, I understood the truth she hadn't yet faced. The most devastating consequence of her decision wasn't losing access to wealth. It was losing access to me. And I wasn't done deciding how much of that loss she was meant to feel. After that evening by the river, everything shifted. Not loudly, not with a dramatic announcement, but in the quiet spaces between decisions. I returned to my routine, but nothing felt routine anymore. My movements, once unnoticed, now had weight. Every call, every email, every meeting, people watched. Not because I was new to power, but because the world suddenly recognized it. I had spent decades moving invisibly. Now even my pauses carried consequence. Lara's presence lingered like a shadow. She didn't reach out again, not directly, but I knew she was watching. Friends mentioned her casually. Mutual acquaintances hinted at her curiosity. I could feel her assessment before it was even spoken. She was measuring me, not as the man she married, but as the man she had underestimated. And that was the point where revenge quietly began. Not the kind you plan with malice, but the kind that emerges when truth, patience, and timing intersect. I didn't call her. I didn't invite explanations. I moved forward silently. Every step I took was deliberate. Investments shifted. Old family trusts restructured. Decisions made in boardrooms echoed in ways she could never have anticipated. Some subtle, almost invisible, others unmistakable once noticed. The world was changing around me, and she had no part in directing it. There were moments I tested the boundaries. Social media mentions, articles highlighting the silent heir strategy, subtle nods to my involvement in major acquisitions. Nothing boastful, just enough for someone who knew me to recognize the truth. I watched the ripple effects with quiet satisfaction. Lara's friends began sending me congratulatory messages. Not to congratulate me, really, but to assess her judgment, questioning if she had truly understood who she married. They wanted context, perspective, reassurance, and I let them linger in ambiguity. Every interaction became a lesson in patience, a demonstration of the invisible power of restraint. People assumed my calmness meant indifference. They didn't realize it was calculated. Precision doesn't shout, it waits. Then came the small confrontations, not face-to-face, but indirect. A mutual friend casually asking about Laura's reaction, a journalist's question hinting at personal motivations behind my financial decisions. Each probe was a test, and I responded with silence, letting implication do the work words could never achieve. The psychological tension grew. It was slow, but inevitable. Friends and colleagues began discussing Laura behind her back. What did she think? Did she regret leaving? Did she understand the full extent of what she had walked away from? I didn't start those conversations, but I let them flourish. Like a seed planted in fertile soil, they grew on their own. And all the while, I stayed present without presence. I moved in spaces she could glimpse but not reach. Financial news, board announcements, strategic partnerships, subtle public appearances that hinted at influence without revealing the entire picture. She had no idea which pieces were deliberate and which were merely necessary. The ambiguity itself became a weapon. Then one evening I received an email from her lawyer. Simple, polite. Lara would like to discuss matters regarding mutual investments and past agreements. Nothing else. No urgency, no pressure. I didn't reply immediately. I let it sit. Hours passed. A full day passed. Then, finally, I responded. Concise, neutral, legal formalities only. The subtlety wasn't lost on her. The message was clear. She could approach, but control had shifted. It was a turning point. Not dramatic, but undeniable. For the first time since she left, she experienced what it meant to have influence removed quietly but effectively. To realize that the man she underestimated was now untouchable in ways she had never anticipated. That's when I understood a critical lesson about revenge. It doesn't have to roar to be heard. It doesn't have to destroy to be felt. Sometimes it exists in silence, in patience, in the subtle shifting of control until the other person recognizes the true cost of their choices. Every morning after, I would review the day's movements, the investments I approved, the strategic decisions I had orchestrated. Each one a gentle reminder of restraint turned into influence. I wasn't flaunting power, I was demonstrating inevitability. And I knew she was noticing. Not openly, not in words, but in the slight hesitation of mutual acquaintances when her name arose, in the cautious phrasing of those who knew both of us, in the quiet recalibration of her assumptions about me. She had left a stable, ordinary man, confident in his simplicity. She now glimpsed what that simplicity concealed. And I watched her, quietly, from a distance, as reality began to reveal itself. Because sometimes revenge isn't about confrontation, it's about showing someone the truth and letting them live with it. The subtle power of timing, the quiet weight of knowledge, the realization that the life she abandoned wasn't small at all. It was carefully, deliberately immense, and she was no longer part of it. Not yet broken, not yet fully aware, but inch by inch the consequences of her departure were unfolding.
The momentum of change was undeniable now. Every subtle shift, every quiet move I made had compounded into a reality that no one could ignore, not even Laura. It started with invitations she could no longer influence, gala events, philanthropic dinners, board announcements. Opportunities she once might have accessed through proximity were now carefully curated without her knowledge. She had assumed that walking away had preserved her distance. In reality, it had only highlighted how absent she was from the decisions shaping the world we had once shared. I began to see the signs in her circles. Mutual acquaintances would hesitate before mentioning her. They would couch their words, careful to avoid revealing too much. And yet she could feel the invisible barriers, the subtle reminders that she was no longer part of the equation, that her departure had cost her more than she realized. Then came the letters. Not legal letters, not aggressive threats, but carefully phrased messages from advisors and board members. Each one acknowledged her awareness of past agreements, her past influence, and the changes underway, all without overtly confronting her. They were gentle nudges, but precise, designed to remind her that control had shifted quietly but irrevocably. I watched her process it all. I imagined her pacing at night, rereading emails, questioning the decisions she had once taken for granted. Had she underestimated me? Had she assumed my quiet life was a reflection of weakness rather than strategy? I knew she was beginning to understand, and that realization alone carried a weight far heavier than money could ever measure. At the same time, my own life had become a series of controlled demonstrations. Every investment, every strategic choice, every public appearance was carefully aligned to show influence without boasting. I didn't need attention, I needed acknowledgement of the truth, that restraint and patience often speak louder than immediate action. I met with Laura once more, indirectly through a mutual advisor who had been instructed to convey only the essentials. She wanted insight into a complex deal. I provided what was necessary, but nothing more. The balance of information, carefully maintained, left her intrigued and frustrated in equal measure. Every fact she received was measured, every omission deliberate. She was learning the hard way that power isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's invisible until the consequences hit, and by the time someone realizes it, the moment of choice is already past. It was in those quiet interactions that I saw the full scope of my influence. The world was reacting to decisions she could no longer affect. People who had once deferred to her attention now deferred to mine. Influence had shifted silently, almost imperceptibly, and that, I realized, was the most effective kind of revenge. I didn't seek her regret. I didn't seek confrontation. I wanted awareness, understanding, recognition that the life she had walked away from was never ordinary, that her choices had consequences extending far beyond immediate satisfaction. Then one evening, I received a message from her directly. Short, controlled. I see now. I understand more than I did before. I didn't reply, because some lessons aren't meant to be acknowledged aloud. Some truths are meant to settle quietly in the mind, expanding with each reflection. I allowed her the space to experience that realization fully, the uncertainty, the hesitation, the internal reckoning, the awareness that the man she had left behind had never been what she assumed, and that life, when patiently orchestrated, doesn't always require confrontation to assert dominance. The months that followed were a masterclass in subtlety. Decisions were made, moves executed, power redistributed.
And with every step, the world recognized me, not for spectacle, not for show, but for the meticulous, patient, unyielding force of someone who had waited decades for the moment to arrive. Laura observed from the sidelines. She had access to information, but lacked influence. She could see the shape of things to come, but she could no longer participate in shaping it. And that, I realized, was the true culmination of restraint turned revenge. Not anger, not public shaming, but the quiet realization that leaving had cost her far more than she ever anticipated. In the end, the lesson was clear. Timing is everything. Patience is more potent than impulse, and the most powerful consequences often arrive quietly, long after the initial choice has been made. By the time she fully grasped the scope of what she had walked away from, the world had already adjusted around me. Control, influence, recognition, they were all in my hands. And she had nothing but observation. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it exists in the silence of absence, in the measured pacing of decisions, in letting someone live with the weight of understanding that comes too late. And she would live with it forever.
The final act of this story wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. After months of quiet strategy, of patience, of letting the truth unfold at its own pace, the conclusion arrived naturally. Laura reached out one last time. Not for reconciliation, not for confrontation, simply to understand. The phrasing was careful, measured, respectful, but her hesitation betrayed everything she hadn't said in the months since the world discovered the truth. I met her in a small cafe, one with neutral walls and soft lighting, no dramatic setting, no witnesses, the kind of place where words carry weight because there's nothing else to distract you. She smiled, but it was faint, cautious. "I wanted to see for myself," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "to understand how it all happened, how you managed everything." I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the silence stretch between us. Timing, after all, had always been my ally. She had left, believing the life she walked away from was ordinary. Now she was here, realizing it had never been. "I never hid to deceive you," I said, finally. "I hid to survive, and to protect the life I was building, not just for me, but for the responsibilities I inherited." She nodded, absorbing every word. "I see that now. I misjudged everything." And she had. Every assumption she'd made about ambition, drive, success, it had been based on appearances. She had valued the visible, the loud, the immediate. She had failed to see the quiet depth of patience, the strength of restraint. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had left a future she couldn't measure, only to realize its true scale after it was too late to participate. And that was the essence of the lesson she hadn't wanted to learn in the first place. The world doesn't wait. Influence doesn't wait. And neither does truth. I didn't offer her a second chance. That wasn't the point. The point was recognition, letting her understand that choices have consequences, and timing changes everything. As we parted, there was no bitterness, no hostility, just an acknowledgement of reality. She had been given the full measure of her decisions, and I had walked through them, unshaken, deliberate, and precise. In the weeks that followed, I focused on what truly mattered, restructuring the legacy my father had left me, building enterprises that aligned with my vision, my ethics, my sense of purpose. The public continued to speculate, analysts continued to probe, but I moved with calm confidence, every step, every decision, deliberate. And through it all, I never forgot the quiet lesson embedded in those months of revelation. Some agreements protect assets, yes, but others reveal judgment. Some contracts guard wealth, but the most revealing ones expose perception, timing, and understanding. Laura hadn't lost wealth. She hadn't lost stability. She had lost certainty in love. She had lost the chance to recognize value before it announced itself. And that
in the grand calculus of life, is often the harshest form of consequence. I, on the other hand, hadn't gained attention. I hadn't gained approval. I hadn't gained revenge in the traditional sense. I had simply remained who I was, patient, calculated, unseen, until the moment arrived when truth could speak for itself. And it did. Because some victories are quiet. Some triumphs are invisible until the world suddenly realizes they were there all along. Some lessons can't be taught. They must be experienced. Laura walked away with knowledge. I walked forward with everything I had quietly earned. And in the end, that was all either of us could take from the story. Timing had done its work. Patience had done its work. And the man she thought she knew had finally stepped out of the shadows, not to punish, not to boast, but simply to exist as the person he had always been. The prenup hadn't cost her a billionaire husband. It had revealed something far more uncomfortable, that you can never fully know a man until his silence ends. And I had waited, precisely as I intended.